This is Rebecca Podos from the Reese Literary Agency, and I'm going to be answering questions today. So I thought about this, and YA wasn't really anything like the genre that it is now when I was a teenager. Growing up in like the sort of early to mid aughts, I came in right before the start of the big YA trilogies and series like Twilight and Hunger Games. I missed that by like a year or two. So back then it kind of went from sort of like children's books or what would be middle grade. Um, and with like some exceptions, directly into adults. So I was reading a lot of adult books when I was a teenager, as opposed to now when I'm reading a lot of teen books. But I was absolutely obsessed with this long-running series called the Tomorrow series by an Australian author. Um, about these teens living in the bush in Australia post invasion. And it sounds like many other YA premises, but the author treated the characters with so much respect and as they were wrestling with conflicting feelings and like moral quandaries and grief and ethics. And again, like just as a teen, I felt so respected by an adult author. And I think I have carried that into the YA books that I love today, and ideally the YA books that I try and write. I think there are a lot of every author, there's no one process. Authors do it all different ways. And I know some authors who have many ideas at once and they kind of like put everything into a file, or they've got multiple tons of projects going on and just see what idea blossom. I have like the fortune of only having really one idea at any given moment. But the genesis of an idea for a book that I'm about to work on usually starts with some concept of an outside world, like the framework for the story, whether it's a magical system or a time period or a setting, like set at a water resort in New Mexico. And then that paired with an inside story of this character. And we'll talk a little bit more about like developing a character from the beginning, but it usually starts with a character and a location, whether that be in a world, in a time period, again, in the contemporary setting, and mashing those two together and just seeing the interesting points where they intersect and put pressure on one another, and how they kind of like showcase each other to their best benefit. I don't. I am trash at keeping writing routines. Again, everybody has a different process, and I have many friends who will sit down and hammer out 3,000 words from 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. and then go about their lives, or they have a lot of structure to their day. I'm lucky also because I have a job as a literary agent, which is not super structured. So if I get a natural break in my day at 11 a.m. or 4 p.m., or if I don't get a break until after the end of the day, or just it doesn't work out that I'm writing that day. Granted, if I'm on a deadline, it's a little bit different, but for the most part, I don't have a lot of structure. I like to think that even when I'm not sitting in front of my computer, chipping away at a document, I'm doing things which feed into my writing, which we can also talk about in another question. But respect your process. I don't have a very structured process, but somehow, the books get written. That's also dependent upon if I'm on deadline. One of the things I was talking about just now was doing other things that help to uh, contribute to your writing beyond just like sitting and staring at a Word document, because sometimes just sitting and staring at a Word document is not going to get stuff flowing again. It's not necessarily going to help you find that doorway into your story that you're looking for. So it might be me consuming other media. I'm again lucky in my day job that I get to read a lot of stories by writers and authors that I respect. So I get kind of like the benefit of experiencing their creativity, and then that sort of all cycles back into feeding my creativity. It's, I think, really helpful to, if you're stuck in a story or sort of like mired in doubt about a story, um, go back in and figure out why you fell in love with it in the first place, why you felt compelled to tell that story. And then sometimes, again, deadlines allowing, you do just need a little space to be able to come back into a document and be like, okay, I see where I went wrong. I made a choice here and I stuck with it and I wrote myself into a dead end. Now, with like this cold eye of separation, I can go back and change that choice and proceed from there. So that combination of walking away from a book, trying to figure out why I fell in love with a book, and then hopefully trying to figure out how to fix the book is what gets me writing. I think the number one thing that I would say here is the ways in which writing sci-fi and fantasy is not different than writing contemporary historical. I think it's really easy to fall into a trap of like, oh, it's made up, it's detached from our world, it's in a completely different galaxy or realm, happening to people who have never set foot on this earth or in this space in our socio-political context or whatever. So we can kind of do whatever we want. But the people who are going to be reading our stories are located in this world, and they are bringing to their reading experience, their cultural context, their history, their experiences. And so I think you have to be just as responsible with sci-fi and fantasy as you do in a contemporary or a grounded genre, because uh, writing again in another universe, it's not as separate from our experiences as you might hope or think. And just like keeping that responsibility in mind is important. Um, when I'm starting out with a character, I think the first things I need to know about this character are A, what do they want? And B, what do they need? If I know what they want, then I know how to sort of like set them off on their path after we've established the world as it exists for them. I can, create a character within that context who is in a small town and wants to move to the big city. And then I know which way they're pointed and what kind of inciting incident has to happen to set them on the road to possibly being able to succeed in their goal or being having to fail in their goal. But if I know where they're starting, then I know what they actually need, which is generally the process of your character arcing, is coming to discover that. Then I know where I want them to end up. And so I know where they're headed. And then I can kind of work backward between the two to plot out their arc, who they are at the beginning of the story, what they believe about themselves, and what they're going to discover about themselves and the world as they move forward towards their goal. So that's where I like to start. So my biggest thing is obviously, world building being kind of like all of the external forces that shape your character, that created the person that they are, and that are going to exert influence and pressure on them throughout the story, like actual geography, landscape, the political system of your character's homeland, their financial system, you know, the history of this world, any magical systems that exist or systems of technology, um, all things that created the environment that created your character. And it's really hard to know when and where to disperse that information, because I think world building is really fun. It's one of my favorite things to do. And so you end up with like possibly documents upon documents of all of your compiled facts about the world. And then either sometimes you end up with an incredibly sort of like info heavy first couple of chapters where you're trying to establish all of this stuff. Or you end up sort of erring in the other direction and going really light on the world building because you don't want to bog your book down. And then we kind of feel a little like we're floating through the, space of your story without being like firmly rooted in it. And so I would say that knowing what world building information to include and when kind of comes down to what is relevant to your character in that moment, like what is going to illuminate your character for the reader. Again, what is going to like exert pressure upon your character in that moment that's going to steer them down this path or create a roadblock for them. That information, like having it sort of naturally come up in such a way that we understand where your character is and what they're going through and why in that moment, um, helps me to figure out, you know, what information and what world building to drop and when. The biggest mistake that I see people make in their writing, um, I mean, kind of in at least in sci-fi and fantasy, the two things that I just talked about, being like either not having a firm grasp on the world that their character exists in and how it reflects upon their character. But those are kind of sci-fi and fantasy specific. I guess more generally, I talked about having an outside story, which is the overarching like plot, what actually happens in your book, a journey from one realm to another, or a quest to save a space station. I'm being incredibly like archetypical in my sci-fi fantasy trope, but having that just sort of float above the internal story, who your character is, where they come from, what they want, sort of like the emotional journey that they're going to be going through. And when those two, your external and your internal storyline, don't communicate and they're just kind of like free floating from one another, um, I don't understand uh, why it's important that this specific story is happening to this specific character. So, for instance, your character wants to solve the problem that they see ghosts because ghosts are scary, and who would want to see ghosts? Okay, that's one thing. Or your character is, somebody who is deeply haunted by their tragic past, and the ghosts that they are seeing are dragging them back towards that path instead of allowing them to move forward into the future. Just again, like sort of archetypical plot, but you want to try and sew those two together again so that we understand why this has to happen to this specific character to create a story that couldn't have uh really unfolded any other way. um would be, yeah, I think kind of a big one for me. Consume media, read books, read all kinds of books, watch shows, watch actual play, read the news. Um, it's all useful. It all teaches you what kind of storytelling you like, what you're drawn to. Again, like something you see in one genre can sort of open a doorway into the story that you're trying to tell. It all teaches you, and it all, if nothing else, kind of like refills that creative well. And so getting better at your craft, in addition to like diligence, is I think a lot of consumption of other people's craft, and sitting with it and admiring it and figuring out what you can take from it and what doesn't maybe work for you. Your journey is your journey, and your path to publication is your path to publication. And it's really easy from the outside to think of like, okay, getting an agent is the end goal. Getting a book published is the end goal. Getting 10 books published, being a New York Times bestseller. There are all these sort of like goals along the way that you can feel like you're sort of trying to rush to meet. And it doesn't happen at the same speed for everybody, doesn't happen in the same way for everybody. And success honestly looks like so many different things for so many different people. And it's not gonna look the same for you and the person next to you. Keeping your eyes on your own paper is really common advice in this industry. And I think keeping your eyes on your own journey, you have things that you want to accomplish, you have things that you can control, and you have things that you can't. And in addition to that, I would just say figuring out how to separate your love of writing and your appreciation of your own craft and of yourself from those like goalposts and those successes that you have in mind. Because again, there's so much in this industry that you can't control and is not necessarily a reflection upon you or your craft or your worth as a writer and certainly a person. So keeping that in mind and just figuring out how to separate those two early on in any creative field is kind of the best advice I can give. So thank you so much for listening to my answers and happy writing, everybody.